Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May Integration Down Under webcast. You should be able to see my screen now. If you, I'll look at the questions window now. Yeah, okay. So let's get started. Just to go over the organizers, we've got Martin in Perth, Dan in Brisbane, Renee in Sydney, Wagner in Auckland, and myself in Melbourne. And tonight's presenter is Wagner from Auckland, talking about Microsoft Flow and Logic Apps. And let me just hand over the screen to Wagner to get started.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So we're going to be talking about Logic Apps versus Microsoft Flow today. Which technology should I choose? It's a question that I've been seeing a lot of people asking for the last couple of years, so try to give you some guidance and some help with that. So my name is Wagner Silveira. I'm the Principal Integration Architect at Theta. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can contact me on Twitter on wsilveiranz. You can send me an email to wagnersilveira at noteyourself.tech. Or if you want to see some of my work, you can go to the blog. What we have in the agenda today, first we're going to kind of recap a little bit about what Logic Apps is, what Flow is, and how trying to highlight some of the stuff that might differentiate them. Right, so we're going to be doing a little bit of a comparison between those two offers. We're going to try to answer the million-dollar questions, like which one should I choose? And then a little bit of summary so you can work with that with some pointers when you know more. So first things first, getting started. What Azure Logic App is a tool to automate workflows and orchestrate business process, right, in an easy way. So one of the big things or the big advantage of Logic Apps is that you have set of out-of-the-box connectors that reduce that integration problems that you have. Like before, you have to know exactly how some APIs works, how some SDK works for you to be able to connect. With the Logic Apps, the idea is that you can simply configure instead of having to program those connections, right? It connects and integrates data both from cloud and to on-premises, so it helps you to connect those two different worlds in a way, and allow you to do B2B and enterprise messaging now in the cloud. Something that we usually would be doing on premises with Bishtalk. If you attach to the Microsoft technologies, now you can bring up to the cloud and do something similar or create hybrid environments, right? And it has a powerful web-based workflow designer. That means that you can simply go to the portal and start working and having something ready in minutes. If you needed to push that to different environments, then that's where you have some other tools that will help with that. So some of the details around the Logic Apps. From a pricing point of view, there is no free tier, so there is no free lunch on that. But on the other hand, the Logic Apps pricing is based on micro billing, right? And it's based on actions that is being executed. If you're thinking of a Logic App, you're going to have like a set of steps, and what the engine is going to charge you is each one of these steps that's been executed on every time that the Logic Apps run. You're going to see that why I'm highlighting that, because that's going to be a little bit different when on the Flow world. The other thing that is quite new, is just being GA in build, is the subscription-based offer from Microsoft around Logic Apps. That's what they call the integration SaaS environment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what it is and when can we use or should we use it. It offers a cloud and a hybrid model, right? So When you wanted to work with on-premises, you can connect to other systems using the on-premises data gateway. And what the on-premises data gateway does for you is open a connection from on-prem into the cloud that is secure and only allow the logic apps that has access to that on-premises data gateway pipe to communicate. And some of the connectors for logic apps has the ability to connect via on-premise data gateway. If you wanted to do a hybrid model based on integration, the direct integration between your own network, on-premises network, and a virtual network, this is another place where the ICE can help you. So you have VNet integration just based on the integration service environment. Is quite extensible, right? It allow you to create your own custom connectors. So if you have an API or you have like a old SOAP services, you can wrap that around connector logic, and you're going to be using that the same way there is a connector that exists for logic apps out of the box. What that means for you, that means that if you have like services that you already implemented, you can generate an easy way to integrate with that, creating a custom connector. It have kind of couple of implementation models, right? One of them is you can go to the portal and you can simply do implement your logic apps there. At the end, when it's ready, it is ready to be used. You can clone, you can copy that, you can generate a template out of that to deploy in other environments. Or you can use an IDE like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to generate your actual code and publish from there into different environments. The monitoring experience for logic apps, it allows you to have a lot of information about the logic app when you're running inside the portal. So you can see lots of information for a single logic app and inside the portal, or you can have an aggregated view using log analytics for a group of logic apps that creates a solution. And finally, governance is all based on the Azure model, right? So that you deploy logic apps into subscriptions, and in theory, those subscriptions connects your representation or your development, testing, and production. Or you can have a single subscription with multiple resource groups, and those resource groups are the representation of your development, test, and production environments. Your access control for things like who can create logic apps, who can operate the logic apps, and you can see things as all based on Azure role-based access control. So in a nutshell, this is like the things that matters for logic apps when you wanted to compare that with Flow to try to find which one you want to choose. A little bit about integration service environment before we go and start talking about Microsoft Flow. So integration service environment is a dedicated model, right? So what that means is that it's going to be a private, closed environment that belongs to your organization, and that replicates or that contains all the functionality that the consumption model of logic apps has, with some extras. So it's going to give you an isolated workload. When you're working with logic apps today on the consumption model, what happens is that you're sharing the resources behind the scenes. So you're in a pool of resources. That means that there are some throttling in place and some checks and balances that guarantee that you play fairly and play safely with everyone else in the playground. Because of that, it might be that sometimes you throttle and you stop from doing things as fast as you want to do because you're in a shared environment. On that isolated workload, the limits that you're going to have is the limits of the model that you bought. It has a set of capacity, but it's all yours to use. You're paying that as a monthly subscription instead of the micro billing that you're talking before, and it's kind of a fair amount of money on that, right? So because you're replicating a whole engine with a whole set of functionality, you're going to pay the price to have that available. It allows you to have VNet integration. That means that now, instead of connecting to things through on-premise data gateway, you can refer to services or APIs inside of your network as soon as you have that VNet integration configured. And it's usually aimed to large volumes of transactions, right? So because of the monthly subscription prices quite substantial, you only want to have integration service environments when that investment makes sense for you. Usually I see clients that are using that in one of two scenarios. One, he needs that isolated, isolated model from a security point of view, or they have so much volume that the price of running that on consumption is not feasible. And one thing that is quite interesting is when you create in a logic apps, you still have the same experience in the portal, but when you're starting to create the logic apps, you're saying where you deploy, and on top of all the existing consumption regions, your integration service environment is going to appear to you like another region, and that's the place where you decide when you're going to deploy that logic app into the integration service environment. After that, the rest of the process is relatively the same. The other thing that is interesting to talk about logic apps is the development support, right? So on the development support, as soon as you need to branch out of the portal because you want to do things a little bit more connected to the normal software development life cycle, you would have support on Visual Studio that allow you to do something quite similar to what you'd be doing on the portal. You're going to have a designer support. You're going to be able to create your logic apps. By the end of that, you have to go and publish. You have that published, and then you can test on the portal. Another experience that is starting to lit up is the experience on Visual Studio Code, where right now you don't have designer support, but basically you're writing the code in JSON, right? It's a bit strange, but from what I see, that there is a lot of people that is kind of starting to enjoy that. For me, at this stage, feels a little bit like Powered by Notepad, but I know that the designer support is coming for Visual Studio Code at some stage, so we should be keeping an eye on that. The deployment from the portal is not automated, but as soon as you're starting to work with one of the IDEs, because in the end, you're going to have a bunch of the ARM templates for you to deploy, then you can start to create the automated deployments and parameterize that and build that inside a CI/CD pipeline. And one thing that is quite important to notice around this deployment part is that the official guidance for deployment is still kind of in progress, because the tools are being like heavily worked right now to get a better experience. Right now, deploying logic apps, extracting from the portal or generating that on Visual Studio and creating these steps to put that on a build pipeline is a bit of a mission. But is work that Microsoft is, I know there is some work on Microsoft right now to try to improve that. So that is logic apps for us, right? From the Microsoft Flow point of view, you can see there is I have pretty much the same tagline. automate workflows and orchestrate business process easily. Because in theory, those processes, those two tools pretty much do the same thing. And that's from where all the confusion starts, right? But the Microsoft Flow is starting, it has out-of-the-box connectors that reduce of the productivity challenges. So the idea or the original aim for the Microsoft Flow was for what Microsoft was calling the citizen integrator, is the guy that was not a developer, but was tasked with either repetitive tasks or automation of some sort inside of the organization. And those business processes or Microsoft Flow helped them to create those business processes easily. The tool evolved a lot from this original idea, and today it becomes more like a productivity tool similar to Logic Apps with some basic differences. So you can connect and integrate data from on-cloud to on-premises, right? And you're going to see that that is available in certain offers from Microsoft Flow, but not from all of them. You have like first-party integration and Office productivity in the cloud as a main focus, right? You see more and more Microsoft Flow being embedded in Office applications, in D365 products, and that is making sure that the things that you need to do for what the Microsoft calls the integration at the last mile can be done easily with a tool that, when that becomes more mission critical, or you need to rely on that and need a little bit more support, be migrated into an enterprise offer that is Logic Apps. It has the same powerful web-based workflow designer. So the experience that you have in Flow and the experience that you have in Logic Apps from a development point of view, or at least from designing a workflow, is quite similar. So let's start to compare the details similar to what we did with Logic Apps. The first thing is that the pricing model. Different from Logic Apps, Microsoft Flow has a free tier. It has an Office and a D365 offer. So if you have an Office 365 subscription or a Dynamics 365 subscription, you're going to have access to a different version of Microsoft Flow than what you have on the free tier. And if you need like things that are more advanced, you also have two plans that is like pay tiers that you can access. So Microsoft Flow Plan 1 and Microsoft Flow Plan 2. We're going to talk a little bit about those ones in a minute. Cloud and hybrid model. So similar to Logic Apps, you can have the on-premise data gateway on selected connectors and on selected offers. The free tier doesn't give you that, and some of the Office tier, if I'm not wrong, also doesn't give you that. But the Dynamics offer and the Plan 1 and 2 would allow you to have on-premise data gateway. You can create custom connectors just like you could create with Logic Apps. That means that you can actually stand what you have, and you can manage that and publish those custom connectors for other people on your organization. From an implementation model, there is no IDE, right, offline, not necessarily offline, because the IDE for Logic Apps and Visual Studio is still not offline, but you only have the web-based for implementation, right? So you can only create flows in the Flow portal. From a monitoring point of view, you can have the run history and can see information about the flow inside each one of the individual flows. And on one of the paid tiers, you have access to what they call the flow analytics. There is some insights about how your flow is working and performing, but those two are still associated to a single flow instead of that aggregated view. And from a governance point of view, the governance is based on Office 365, so it's connected to your Office 365 administrator. And one of the things that is quite interesting that we're going to be touching base in a minute is the idea of the data loss prevention policies, which you don't have in Logic Apps. With that, what they say is some of those connectors cannot play together because I have a chance of having a data breach or having a chance of exposing my corporate data into a SaaS application that I don't want it to do. So you can configure, depending on where you're running Microsoft Flow, which connectors they have available and how they can play together. But you're going to see that that is only available in one of the upper tiers. Is when you're starting to use that as a corporation. And from an access control, you can, by default, each flow only belongs to you, but you can now starting to share your flows with other people on what they call team flows, and then those team flows is going to appear the same copy on everyone that you share it with. And Microsoft is starting to come with the idea of solutions where you package Power Apps and flows together and see all of that as one solution that you can manage. So let's talk a little bit about the pricing. The first thing is the pricing here is micro billing per execution versus micro billing per action. That is quite important to understand. While on Logic Apps, you're going to be paying for every single action that you execute inside the Logic app. On Flow, what you have is allowance on a number of executions. So doesn't matter if the flow has one action or 20 actions or 50 actions. Every time that flow executes, you're going to be paying for. You're going to take one less from your allowance, which means that now you can create things that are a little bit more verbose inside Flow instead of trying to optimize for the payment that you usually end up doing on Logic Apps. So each license has an allowance on executions and also has a minimum period that you can pull, right? So the free tier, if I'm not wrong, has 2,000 executions. The Office and Dynamics 365 go up a level, I think, for 4,500. Then the plan price 1 and plan price 2 has another thing on top of that. One thing that is important to notice is that execution allowances actually bubble up to the organization. So if you have 10 licenses and each one of those 10 licenses is an Office 365 license that, let's say, has 4,500 executions amount, that means that your organization is allowed to run 45,000 executions of Microsoft flows, right? So it's not that you don't use your allowance that you lose. It's going to be spread across the organization. Flow plan 1 and 2 can be considered kind of paid add-ons because what they're going to be doing is going to be adding functionality to what you already have on the plan 1 on the free and the Office 365. For free and Office 365, the main differences are going to be the access to some of the connectors and also the allowance and the limits that you have on polling. While Flow Plan 1 and 2 is starting to bring a little bit of extra goodies. Some of the advanced features are only available on paid plans. For example, the Flow Plan 1 bring you the premium connectors. There are a set of connectors that Microsoft think that is required more for corporate flows or business process automation related to the corporation versus the things. Hello? All good? So compared to stuff that would be done by a single individual, right? On the flow plan 2, we also have the organization policies that allow you to set up those data loss prevention that we discussed, meaning that you can say that in a specific environment or in a specific group of flows, you can only run those types of connectors. And Flow Plan 2 also bring you on top of the premium connectors the idea of business process flow that is like multi-step processes with the approvals in between. The development support for Flow basically, we can only do that on the browser, on the designer. The flows can belong to a team or to an individual, so you can actually share your flow, and then those guys, the other people that is on the team is going to be able to contribute to that flow and going to be able to see, to run, and to monitor that. One thing that is quite interesting in Flow that we don't have in Logic Apps is the idea of the flow checker. So when you're creating a flow, you can check if the syntax and everything that is in the flow is correct before you save, and it's going to say where the things might go wrong. In Logic Apps, you only have that when you actually try to save, right? It does the validation before saving, but it doesn't give you an idea of what is going wrong with your flow. Deployment for the flow is not automated, right? You have to package and deploy between environments. And by the way, environments from that I'm talking here is the Office 365 environments. So you can create multiple environments on your Office 365 tenant and represent different areas of your corporation. It can be dev, test, prod. It can be HR, IT, and sales. You define how those environments work. From a governance point of view, one of the things that it has is the Microsoft Flow Analytics, so it allows you to know how it's performing, what is happening, and what the rate of errors and things like that. And they also have the organization policies, both of them on the plan 2, right? As I said before, the organization policies allow you to set up this data loss prevention and say people is only able to run things for those connectors on the production environment can only have certain types of connectors. The test environment can only have certain type of connectors, or the playpen can have all the connectors, or only the connectors related to social media, while the corporate can only have the connectors related to the SaaS and the D365, for example. So you can define, and you can also say that some of them are not available. The user access is all based on Office 365 users. So you as an administrator says if the user has Microsoft Flow and what level of Microsoft Flow it has. So if we start to compare those offers and see what we can have here in terms of what is the balance and why should I choose one versus why should I choose another. There is a certain number of things that only Logic Apps can do for you. And what is it? The first one is the IDE-based development experience. So if you need to be part of a team that is working with Visual Studio or working with source control, and you need to work with that as part of your development of workflows, you need to use Logic Apps. If you need to automate your deployment, right, the support for automated deploy using the ARM templates, that's another thing that only Logic Apps can do. As I said before, the guidance and the process of generate those templates, and most important, to parameterize those templates, it's something that is heavily being worked on Microsoft. The experience is not fantastic right now, but you can do that, and it's better than a year ago. So I'm expecting on the next 6 months we see a lot of things happening on that area. If you need to access the code for fine-tuning, that's something that only Logic Apps can do. Basically, what Logic Apps is behind the scenes is a set of JSON commands and a kind of an array of commands that are executed based on a certain dependency. So action 2 runs after action 1, action 3 runs after action 2, etc. In certain cases, you actually need to have access to that code to either speed up your development process, because, for example, you have, I've been working a lot of Dynamics 365 and Business Central, and the entities for those two applications have sometimes hundreds of items. The portal is going to be showing the most important, but it's to find them and search for them on the designer sometimes quite tedious. It's easy to just go directly to the code and type what you need and only put like 5 out of those 100 items. That's something that you're only able to do that on Logic Apps. You're not going to be able to do that kind of stuff on Flow. The aggregated monitoring and alerting via log analytics is again something that you only can find on Logic Apps. You'll not be able to find that on Microsoft Flow, although the governance and the monitoring piece on Flow is also running a very fast pace. So there is chances that this is actually going to happen for Flow as well, or might be something in preview. Finally, if you have B2B scenarios like AS2, EDFAT integration, XML transformations, this is something that you can only be able to do in Logic Apps. Okay, before we go to the Flow, one last thing that I didn't add to the list, but there's also something that you can only can do with Logic Apps. If you need to do VNet integration, you're only going to be doing that using Logic Apps via integration SEFs environment. So things only Microsoft Flow can do. The first thing is that data loss prevention policy. Right now, on Logic Apps, you're always going to have access to all the connectors, right? Then it becomes a matter of you having access to the configuration of the connector to be able to use it. But you cannot stop a developer creating something that gets data from CRM and push data to Twitter if the developer has the credentials to do that. And even worse in some cases is a connection on Logic Apps is shared across multiple Logic Apps. So if you already have a solution in your resource group where you have that connection, you should be able to use that in another Logic App. So it becomes quite hard for you to do that data loss prevention or that kind of restriction inside Logic Apps. You can restrict who can actually access it. Those advanced business process flows and the approval is something that only Microsoft Flow is doing for you today, right? Flow has a really rich approval experience where you can receive the approval into the Flow application. You can see it on the portal. You can receive that on email. And with that advanced business process flow, you can have like multi-stage processes being linked, approve after approval. Logic apps today allow you to do the approval based on an approval email. So you send an email to Outlook and you approve or not, and you can kind of connect those things together, but you don't have the visual representation or the guidance on different locations. You only receive that on the email. And if you forward the email to someone, if someone accepts that or rejects, it's still going to be flowing back to the to Logic apps. So you also don't have the ability to say only the owner of the request for approval is the one that should be approving it. While on Microsoft Flow, you're able to do this. There is a rich integration with Office 365, especially when you're talking about the flow being embedded in tooling. I think if you guys are using Teams, you can see now a flow tab for Teams. You have flow access on Excel, on SharePoint, on Dynamics 365, on all those other applications. So you can create visual diagrams that represents Microsoft Flow and publish that at Flows. So that rich integration with Office, not as Office connectors, but Flow being part of the tool and automating the tool or creating workflows from the tool is something that is quite prominent and something that Microsoft is pushing as well. So finally, the million-dollar question. Which one should I choose? What is the best option for me? How about both? So the technologies are kind of complementary, right? So the idea is that you could have both developers and business specialists working together and merging those things instead of using just one or using just other. So depending on the kind of workflow requirement that you have at certain point, you can decide if you're going to be using Microsoft Flow or if you're going to be using Logic Apps. But it's not that once you start using Microsoft Flow, you should be using only Flow. Once you start using Logic Apps, you should be using only Logic Apps. You can vary depending on your requirements, and those two can coexist together. And Flow can always be exported as a Logic app and implemented into Azure later on, because behind the scenes, those two engines are pretty much the same. So in the end, the final answer is going to depend on what kind of environment you have, what kind of needs for a particular project, what kind of team do you have working. Those guys are developers, or the people is developers, or they are business specialists. What they're going to be doing, what kind of topology, what kind of technologies are involved, right? But not to say that it's like this is too much of a solution architect answer. It always depends. Let's see some things. When should I choose a Logic app? First, if workflows are part of a larger solution involving other Azure resources, then it makes sense that the workflow is part of that solution that can be versioned together or deployed together and live together. If the solution requires source control and CI/CD, so if your process, right, on creating that solution requires that you store that on source control, that you version the solution, and you actually need to have that automated deployment, then you have to use Logic apps. If you need fine-grained control over my code, like access to code behind, like you were talking before, then you have to use Logic apps. If you need closer to real-time triggering for polling, on Flow, you can have the minimum time that you can have is 1 minute on the Flow plans 1 and 2. While with the Office, you have 5 minutes. and with the free, you have a minimum of 15 minutes, if I'm not wrong, for the polling. So if you need to poll data, but you need to be like really close to real time, you need to poll like every 30 seconds or something like this, then you still need to choose Logic Apps for that. Chances are that you're probably going to end up with a different solution instead of polling 30 seconds anyway, but there is things that if you need that requirement, you locked into Logic Apps. If you have monitoring and alerting that is more complex, either because it's part of a larger solution, as I said in the beginning, or it requires the aggregation and some kind of correlation, then you also need Logic Apps. One of the things that Logic Apps connected with the log analytics can give to you is the idea of publishing properties for the Logic Apps as custom properties into your monitoring. So you can actually find a correlation ID or an order number and find if it's being processed successfully or where it was inside log analytics while using Logic Apps. You don't have the same way to do that kind of stuff in Microsoft Flow. The solution requires EDI or XML validation and transformation. And most probably, as we said as well, the solution requires VNet integration. Right, there we go. When should I choose Microsoft Flow? Well, the first thing is, if your solution does not require an Azure subscription, if it doesn't need all the components from the Azure subscription, from Azure, chances are that you could create all of that inside Microsoft Flow, right? So you don't need to generate Azure or generate an Azure subscription and code that just because you need a workflow engine. You have that on Microsoft Flow. If you need to create personal workflows, you're creating stuff just for yourself instead of for a company. So Microsoft Flow is a really good solution, right? It's embedded into your Office 365. You can see that, you can monitor that, and you can work from Office 365 directly. If your solution is the backend of a Power App and Flow works quite well together. So, excuse me, chances are that you're better off working with the Microsoft Flow than is working with Logic Apps. If your organization has a D365 of Office 365 active subscription and requires first-party app automation or business process automation, you already have like a plethora of the flow executions that are ready for you to use. So why are you going to be to another application where you're going to be having to pay for the executions, where you have a pool of the things ready for you to use, a pool of executions ready for you to use. If you have a non-dev background but need organization workflows, you're better off with Microsoft Flow because the tool has been created and is constantly a thought for you to use as a non-developer versus Logic Apps that is aimed to developers first. And if my solution is not part of a big Azure solution, right? So although I have I might be connecting to one specific component in Azure, but it's not like a big, a giant thing where everything is in Azure and my workflow is in just inside Office 365. So if that's not the case, when you have a solution that is maybe deep in the toes on Azure for Service Bus or for storage, but most of your things is between Dynamics 365, SaaS applications, and the Flow, you don't need to go to Logic Apps just for that. You can do that with Flow. My management and monitoring are relatively simple. I'm happy with looking at individual Logic flows and see what's happening instead of having to correlate across multiple Logic Apps or multiple workflows to look at what's happening. So in summary, don't feel pressure to choose just one technology, right? You should be working with those two technologies together. There is a really good article on my To Know More from Kent Ware that talks exactly about that and the different complexities of those of the workflows and how you should be working with those ones. Identify the places where each technology will help you the most and leverage that instead of being working with just one of them. And when it doesn't make a difference, use the one that you feel more comfortable or the one that is going to cost you less. Finally, mix and match is more than okay, right? So having a workflow that starts on Microsoft Flow that drops some stuff on a storage or service bus, and from there you continue on with Logic Apps, it's still a very valid scenario. If you want to know more, I have some more information about the Microsoft Flow pricing here, because I think that is something that is a lot of people need to understand when they invest in more in Flow, and what is the capabilities when you buy a Flow Plan 1 or a Flow Plan 2, what you already have available with Office 365 or D365, etc. I put a little bit more information about integration service environment, right? Is interesting to know that integration service environment just being just GA in build, so it's ready for you to use if you need. Look carefully if it's something that you need to use. It's quite powerful, but if in this case, with great powers come great responsibility and a bit of a great price. The original post from where I had the idea of this talk is on my blog. This is the address for that, for Microsoft Logic Apps versus Microsoft Flow, which one should I choose? And also Logic Apps versus Microsoft Flow, why not both, is a really good article from Kent Ware that you should be reading if you want to get more information on that. And that's me for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? If you can, you can use the question window in the webinar. Go to webinar if you have any questions.
And I'll push my my slides to SlideShare and publish that on Twitter as well.